The question before the jury today was, did George Zimmerman face life-threatening injury at the hands of Trayvon Martin?
Case number 12-CF-1083, State versus George Zimmerman.
All eyes on the courtroom.
I am keeping an open mind on both sides.
The lead detective in this case continued his testimony.
It's against the law for somebody to wear a hoodie at night.
How many burglaries had occurred?
Any indication that Trayvon Benjamin Martin was committing a crime? Did you find any evidence of blood?
He believes Zimmerman was telling the truth.
This is George Zimmerman's best friend.
Recounting what Zimmerman told him about the gun.
His friend said that George Zimmerman was shocked.
The medical examiner will testify.
Did you notice in those pictures the cuts on Mr. Martin's knuckle?
Are any of those abrasions life-threatening?
Zimmerman was not hospitalized.
They always get away.
We take this very seriously.
Would you call them these
We have it on a short delay in order to mute some of the foul language.
is the word, pardon my language again, punks?
We'll take you back to the trial right now.
We're back on the record.
Today, the prosecution called Jacksonville medical examiner Dr. Valerie Rao as an expert witness to testify about the injuries George Zimmerman said he sustained on the night of February 26, 2012, the night that, according to George Zimmerman, he shot and killed 17-year-old Trayvon Martin in self-defense. Here's Dr. Rao's key finding.
After reviewing all of those items, in terms of severity, how would you classify the injuries to the defendant's head?
They were not life-threatening. They were very insignificant.
Dr. Rao came to this conclusion after reviewing evidence in the case, including this video reenactment taped by the Sanford Police Department just the day after the shooting.
I tried to sit up, and that's when he grabbed me by the head and tried to slam my head down. No, my body was on the grass. My head was on the cement. Listen, that's as best as I could feel through my jacket. I felt like my body was on the grass and my head was on the cement, and he just kept slamming and slamming it.
Dr. Rao testified today that the injuries on the back of George Zimmerman's head are consistent with just one blow to the head.
If you hit the head one time, it is consistent with having gotten those two injuries at that one time, because it's an area where it is protruding, because the head is protruding, because the head is a round surface, and so that one impact could result in the two lacerations that you see.
Dr. Rao, using your definition of slamming, your common understanding of slamming, are the injuries to the back of the defendant's head consistent with having been repeatedly slammed into a concrete surface?
No.
Why not?
Because if you look at the injuries, they are so minor that, to me, the word slam implies great force, and the resultant injuries are not great force.
What type and extent of injuries would you expect to see if the defendant's head had been repeatedly slammed into a concrete surface?
So if somebody's head is repeatedly slammed against concrete with great force, I would expect lacerations. I would expect a lot of injury that would bleed profusely, that would necessitate suturing, and so I don't see that in this picture.
Dr. Rao also said that the injuries to Zimmerman's face could have come from just one blow to the nose.
Let's think that I'm the one inflicting the blow. If I was to punch myself right above here, I would get the injury on the nose and on the few contusions on the forehead. So one blow would be able to inflict these injuries.
But during cross-examination, defense attorney Mark O'Mara raised the possibility of George Zimmerman being hit twice.
Let me give you this scenario. He gets hit in the nose like this, just like that, but it does not go up here. So here's the first shot, and here's the second shot. How many is that?
2.
Consistent with that picture?
It could be, yes.
So you're certainly not telling this jury that Trayvon Martin only hit Mr. Zimmerman in the face one time.
I'm just telling you what the injuries are and what it's consistent with.
Joining me now, Faith Jenkins, a former criminal prosecutor, Gary Casimir, a former New York City prosecutor who does criminal and civil litigation, and MSNBC legal analyst Kendall Coffey, who is also a former U.S. attorney. Faith, I was struck by that line of questioning where Dr. Rao said that if she hit herself in the face in a certain way, she could create the George Zimmerman style injury. Was the suggestion, was the prosecution looking for a suggestion there that George Zimmerman may have self-inflicted that injury to his face?
I don't think the prosecution is going that far, but I think that what they're trying to do is show that based on this doctor's testimony, there's simply no way George Zimmerman could have sustained the beating that he alleged he sustained at the hands of Trayvon Martin based on his injuries. She described them as minor and insignificant, and in fact, they could be sustained from one punch. That is very different from what we've heard the past few days from George Zimmerman's own statements, where he said his head was repeatedly slammed against the concrete. He almost lost consciousness. He was hit between 25 and 30 times. And what the prosecutor's now going to argue to the jury, he embellished his story, he lied to the police officers, and why did he do that? Because he's trying to cover up for his own wrongdoing, his consciousness of guilt.
And Gary Casimir, in terms of embellishing the story, I mean, am I correct in that the most Mark O'Mara could get the number of blows up to in cross-examination was the possibility of 2?
Yes.
I mean, because like Faith just said, it's supposed to be a flurry of blows, and the most I heard Mark O'Mara get it up to was the possibility of just 2.
Yeah, I think that's true. However, I think as a defense attorney, what you want to do is create reasonable doubt that he might have been struck more than twice, and that those hits didn't cause any damage, but he was being hit, which caused them to be afraid. The defense attorney has to work with what they have, and what they have here is one expert on the prosecution side saying that, oh, it doesn't look that significant and that bad. I also think what you may have later on is the defense putting George Zimmerman on and explaining what it's like to be in the middle of a fight for your life, and that may take the jury in a different direction here.
Kendall Coffey, what's your guess as to whether we will ever hear that direct testimony from George Zimmerman in the courtroom, in the witness stand?
Frankly, I don't think George Zimmerman's attorneys have any intention of calling him at this point. There have been just a lot of good things that have come out for George Zimmerman, not the least of which was, of course, Chris Serino saying that he indicated that he thought George Zimmerman was telling the truth. This witness for the prosecution definitely helped, not just because she minimized the severity of injuries and any notion that he had to kill somebody in order to prevent serious bodily injury or death, but it does tend to strongly indicate that George Zimmerman was not being truthful in describing the magnitude of his injuries and describing the kind of fight, the alleged beating that actually took place. That could be a key for prosecution in terms of giving them a shot for a conviction.
See, this is where I think where we turn on this. As a defense attorney, I think the problem is, have you established enough to keep your defendant off the stand? Is there enough there? And here you just stated that, you know, he may not have been able to establish that he was in fear for his life, or that there was enough testimony granted from Osterman or anybody else to say that he had a basis to be afraid. I think you need to put Zimmerman on the stand to establish this. You need to show that this man was afraid for his life in order for the defense to overcome the burden there.
They put in all of his statements, including his interview with Sean Hannity. It is very, very unlikely at this point that O'Mara will put Zimmerman on the witness stand. If you watch the Sean Hannity interview, you know why. He would be a terrible witness in this case. When you heard some of the incredibly insensitive things he said, there's no way Mark O'Mara wants him to be cross-examined when he's essentially testified, not subject to cross-examination by the state, putting in his statements.
We're going to get to that Sean Hannity interview coming up here, but I want to show more of what Mark O'Mara did today with Dr. Rao, talking about injuries that Trayvon Martin incurred.
So we have some injuries. The only injuries, as a matter of fact, besides the gunshot wound, are 2 injuries on his knuckles, correct?
Correct.
Curious, since you had a chance to look at the autopsy, were there any other injuries on Trayvon Martin at all?
No.
Any bruising injury?
No.
Any laceration injuries?
No.
Any punctate injuries?
No.
Kendall Coffey, what's your assessment of that part of the testimony?
Well, I think it was helpful for the defense to the extent that it indicates that whoever started the fight and however it turned out, that at least at one point, Trayvon Martin seemed to be getting the better of it and inflicting some injuries on George Zimmerman. Might have been exaggerated by George Zimmerman, but it does look like Zimmerman, up until the time the shot was fired, had more physical injuries than Trayvon Martin.
But Faith Jenkins, it is going to come down to, one of the things it's going to come down to is, was George Zimmerman really in a life-threatening situation, life-threatening to him? And Dr. Rao's testimony was the injuries that he suffered were certainly not life-threatening, and she used that phrase. That seems to be where the prosecution will be, that's the point they'll be emphasizing in final argument.
Right, because we know there's some contact there. George Zimmerman does have some injuries, but just because you get into a fist fight, that does not mean that you then get to turn around and shoot and kill the other person. And so that's what the prosecutors are arguing, based on everything we know about George Zimmerman, what he said about Trayvon, his view of him as suspicious, his view of him as a suspect. He was the person who was inclined to overreact, and that's what he did by shooting and killing him. That's going to be their argument.
Now, the prosecution today was trying to get to an element of second-degree murder that they have to reach, which is acting with depraved mind without regard for human life. And they were using George Zimmerman's language as the route to get to that. We, of course, on this network, because we fear it might damage some mind out there, have to bleep these words that everyone knows and everyone could hear absolutely harmlessly, but that's the convention of this kind of TV. So we're going to do some of that bleeping as we play some of this testimony now.
You know, you did testify when you were cross-examined that those two, these always get away, and pardon my language again, these punks, that he said that because he wanted to interact and meet and invite Trayvon Martin for dinner that night?
Excuse me, Your Honor. That would be speculation.
Sustained.
Are you saying that those words were uttered by the defendant in reference to wanting to meet the victim?
Excuse me, Your Honor. That would be speculation.
Okay. I'll be glad to rephrase it. Sustained. Does that not indicate ill will, hatred, and spite against somebody else, sir?
No, it does not.
In your opinion, calling somebody, reference them as, pardon my language, punks?
That is ill will and spite.
It is?
Yes.
Okay.
Boy, that beeping could not be more ridiculous in an actual trial like this. We should be letting you hear what these words actually are, and you all know what they are. Gary Casimir, you're sitting at the defense table. You've got to be stressed at the fact that George Zimmerman is on tape saying those words.
Yeah, it's very difficult to deal with, you know, looking back and things you've said and might have said in a moment of anger, or when you're thinking that you're chasing somebody down that might have done something wrong. It's very difficult. This is, I go back again, he's going to have to explain some of this on the stand. I mean, how you deal with it is, I think you have to get, and I think the defense will do this, that they would have to describe the emotion that's going on through Zimmerman's head. Was his intent to go out and kill somebody, or was his intent to track down people he thought was committing crimes or loitering or trespassing on the property? Is this something that he was doing? Obviously, this guy has a history of being a watchman. This is not completely out of place and out of character that he thinks this is going on. Whether or not his interpretation of Trayvon was right or wrong is not necessarily the deciding factor here. The deciding factor here was, was that a statement that shows that he was about to do somebody some harm? And that's where they got to get to. And I don't think they're there yet.
All right, we're going to take a break here. We're going to be back with more on today's testimony in the Zimmerman case. And later, in the rewrite, why Texas Republicans don't want you to be able to buy possibly the best car ever made, the Tesla Model S.